By the week before Christmas, winter in her town felt more practical than magical, like a season that had already spent its best energy somewhere else. The snow came lightly and melted into gray slush along the curbs, then froze again in ridges that grabbed at boots and stroller wheels. People still taped paper stars to windows and hung lights in uneven lines, but the streets carried a tired rhythm of errands and quiet worry. Elena Hart noticed it in the way cashiers moved faster, in the way neighbors talked about, after the holidays, like January could erase what December revealed. She was 42, raising 11-year-old twins on her own, and she had learned to keep her face calm even when her chest felt tight. Mornings began with lunches packed at the same narrow counter, a gentle reminder about homework, and a quick check that both kids had their hats. After school drop-off, she drove to a regional grocery warehouse, where she worked in accounts and returns, the unglamorous middle of commerce that keeps everything moving. She could balance a spreadsheet in her head and troubleshoot a handheld scanner when it refused to read, and she had started taking small side jobs fixing receipt printers and card readers for tiny shops. The work was honest, but it was also endless, and she could feel her life shrinking into a loop of just get through this week. Home looked normal if someone glanced quickly, and that was the hardest part. A thin, artificial tree stood in the living room corner, leaning a little because one leg never locked right, while the twins did their best to make it look proud. They had made paper ornaments at school and draped a popcorn garland with sticky fingers, and Elena praised every piece as if it were priceless. Their wish list had turned quieter this year, and she noticed that shift even when they tried to hide it. The boy wanted one evening at the outdoor rink with enough time to actually learn a smooth turn, not just shuffle in circles until the hour ended. The girl wanted a set of colored pencils that would not snap, and a sketchbook that did not bleed through to the next page. Those requests should have been easy, but they carried a message Elena hated hearing. The kids had learned where the limits were. Her younger brother lived across town in a small basement unit, still recovering from a back injury that had ended his warehouse job. He insisted he would be fine, but his cabinets were too bare and his pride too loud, and Elena kept bringing groceries anyway. She did not need a dramatic crisis to motivate her. She needed a way out of slow drowning, the kind that happens while everyone says you look strong. The idea that changed her week arrived in a plain envelope, handed to her at the warehouse during a quiet afternoon lull. A co-worker from shipping, a steady older woman who always seemed to know what was happening before anyone else, slid it across the break room table without ceremony. Inside was a printed notice from a storage facility on the industrial edge of town, the kind of place people drove past without thinking. The headline said "Sealed Bid Sale," and below it, in clean block text, it described a unit from a delinquent commercial account. The phrase that made Elena sit straighter was merchant payment equipment and cash handling gear, followed by the warning, "No preview. Sold as a single lot, pickup windows strict." The unit number was not 17C or anything neat and memorable, just a code that sounded like a shelf in a warehouse. Unit K, 9, row D. Elena read it twice, then once more slower, the way she read contract at work. The co-worker shrugged, almost apologetic. "I saw that line and thought of you," she said. "You're the only one I know who fixes those little machines." Elena didn't answer right away, because she could already feel the argument forming in her own head. It could be dead terminals and scrap metal. It could be a full headache that cost more to haul away than it could ever earn. Or it could be the exact kind of inventory that, in the right hands, became a small business instead of another year on someone else's schedule. That night the apartment held its usual sounds, and Elena moved through them with her mind somewhere else. The twins practiced a winter song on their thrift store keyboard, one sticky key turning every melody slightly wrong, and Elena pretended the imperfection was charming. Later she sat at the kitchen table with a cheap notebook and a mug of tea that cooled untouched, drawing 2 columns the way she did when she had to make a decision without panic. One side listed what would happen if she did nothing, the same overtime requests, the same late payments that never became disasters but never became peace either, the same careful, maybe next month, whenever the kids asked for something small. The other side listed what would happen if she tried to change direction, a certification course at the community college, a legal registration for her repair work, a small reserve to buy parts without begging for net 30 credit. She didn't write pay off debt or fix a roof, because that story was too familiar even to her. She wrote by time, and under it, be home before dark more than twice a week. When she finally opened her laptop, she did not search for miracle stories or easy wins. She searched for how sealed bids worked, what the rules allowed, and how people documented a unit's contents to protect themselves. In a quiet moment that felt strangely human, she tapped a like on a helpful video, subscribed to the channel that explained the paperwork clearly, and left a short comment asking what to photograph first if the unit belonged to a commercial client. It wasn't hope as a slogan. It was her building a small map before stepping into unfamiliar ground. 2 days before the deadline, Elena drove to the storage place during daylight, not to peek inside, but to see what she was dealing with and whether her courage held up in the cold. The facility sat behind chain-link fencing, with rows of tall doors painted a flat blue that looked almost cheerful until you stood close enough to see the rust at the bottoms. She parked, walked the aisle slowly, and found Row D by the stenciled letters on the corner posts. Unit K. 9 looked ordinary at first, except for its height and the way the ground in front of it seemed more scuffed than the others, as if something heavy had been dragged there more than once. A thin crust of frost clung to the rubber seal along the bottom edge, and the lock hardware carried a ring of older rust that suggested years of use. Elena kept her hands in her coat pockets and breathed out slowly, watching the vapor drift away. She imagined what cash handling gear could mean in a business context. Kiosks, armored cabinets, parts crates, maybe old machines lined up in rows. She also imagined the worst explanation, the one that brought police and questions, and she forced herself to look for signs of forced entry or panic. Nothing looked broken. Nothing looked rushed. The unit sat there like a closed mouth, giving away nothing. That blankness felt less comforting than it should have, because it meant the only thing she was truly buying was uncertainty. In the office, the air smelled like burnt coffee and pine cleaner, a thin attempt at holiday cheer. The manager handed her a sealed bid form and pointed at the lines of the kind of practice patience he used on people who asked for exceptions. Elena read every rule anyway, because she had learned that fine print always collects where money's involved. The bid required cash payment if she won, a signed release, and a strict 48-hour window to clear the unit unless she transferred it into her name as a regular rental. She could feel the weight of that clock even before it started. She filled out the form carefully, wrote an offer number that made her stomach tighten, and sealed it in a provided envelope. It wasn't everything she had, but it was enough that losing it would change her winter in immediate ways. The manager didn't sell her a dream, and that helped. He only said the account had belonged to a small subcontractor tied to merchant services, then went quiet like a man who had learned not to add stories to paperwork. Elena dropped the envelope into the locked metal box and felt a small, sharp click inside herself the moment after a decision becomes real. On the drive home, she kept both hands steady on the wheel and told herself she would accept any outcome. Then she saw the twins through the window, bent over the table with their homework, and the thought she tried to deny rose again. She needed this to be more than a lesson. The call came the next afternoon, while Elena stood by the warehouse's loading bay, waiting for a signature on a damaged shipment report. Her phone buzzed, and she recognized the storage office number before she even lifted it. The digits suddenly loud against the noise of forklifts and beeping carts. The manager's voice stayed flat, almost professional, as if announcing a package delivery. Her offer was highest, payment due by 3, terms unchanged. Elena thanked him, ended the call, and stood very still while the world kept moving around her, because her body needed a moment to catch up with what her mind already knew. She drove straight to the bank, withdrew the cash in a neat stack that felt too thin for the risk it carried, and then drove to the facility with the envelope on the passenger seat like something fragile. Paperwork took 5 minutes, and most of her courage. The manager counted the bills, printed a receipt, and slid a brass key and a gate code card across the counter. Without ceremony, Elena held the key in her palm, surprised by how cold it was, surprised by how heavy it felt for something so small. She walked the long road to Road D, the winter sun low and weak, and stopped in front of Unit K, 9 with her breath caught halfway in. The scuffs on the concrete looked deeper from this angle, and she noticed something else she hadn't seen before. Faint parallel marks leading up to the door, the kind left by a pallet jack or a dolly carrying real weight. Elena didn't open the lock. She only touched the metal latch, felt the chill sting her fingertips through the glove, and listened to the silence behind the door as if silence could answer her. Then, from somewhere deeper in the corridor, she heard the manager call to another employee in an offhand tone that still landed like a warning. They would need the facility's heavy dolly again, because those tall machines in K9 had been a nightmare to move. Elena's grip tightened on the key, and she realized she had bought more than a unit. She had bought a question big enough to change her life, and tomorrow she would have to lift the door and hear what that question sounded like in the dark. Morning came with a thin, pale sun that made the slush glitter without warming it, and Elena drove to the storage facility with her gloves on and her jaw set. She had dropped the twins at school with the same calm smile she used every day, even though her stomach felt tight the whole time. In the passenger seat, she carried a flashlight, a roll of painter's tape, a permanent marker, and a notebook with the first page labeled K, 9/row D. It looked like a ridiculous kit for a single mother to bring to a metal door, but it was also the only way she knew to stay steady. Measure, document, control what could be controlled. Inside the yard, the blue door stood in long straight lines, and the air smelled faintly of cold concrete and diesel from a distant truck. When she reached K, 9, she paused with the key in her palm, listening to the quiet, and then she unlocked the padlock and lifted the roll-up door in one firm pull. The door rattled up its track. Coughing dust and cold trapped air spilled out with a dry electrical tang that reminded her the back of old computers. At first she saw only shapes. Then her eyes adjusted and the shapes became a row. Then 2 rows of tall, narrow machines standing shoulder to shoulder, all facing outward like they'd been lined up on purpose. ATMs. Not 1 or 2. A whole line of them, their screens dark, keypads dulled by fingerprints, cables neatly coiled behind them, and the narrow aisle between the rows just wide enough for her to squeeze through sideways. Elena's first reaction wasn't excitement. It was a clean ribbon of fear. Machines like this belonged bolted to floors under cameras, not stored in silence behind a door she had bought with nearly everything she had. Her grip tightened on the notebook as her mind flashed to news clips, to stories of machines ripped from storefronts, to the kind of questions she could not answer fast enough if someone in uniform stepped into this aisle and asked why she was here. She forced herself to slow down because panic makes people careless, and carelessness was the one thing she couldn't afford. Elena stood at the threshold and photographed the unit wide, then photographed again from a slightly different angle, so every machine could be counted. She moved down the aisle and took close-ups of serial plates, faded inspection stickers, and small service tags taped to the side panels. Nothing looked smashed or hurried, and that fact mattered. The machines were intact, their casings uncracked, their cable bundles tied with zip ties, like someone had done a careful decommissioning, and then simply stopped showing up. Along the left wall sat a low steel pallet with a square crate strapped down in heavy bands, and the crate carried a stenciled label half buried under grime. Spares/cash modules. On the right side, pushed tight against the wall, stood a waist-high metal cabinet with a combination dial and a keyhole, the kind that looked more like a service safe than office furniture. Elena didn't touch that cabinet yet. She didn't touch anything that could be spun into a story later. She kept photographing, kept writing, kept breathing. In her mind, she could almost hear the voices of people who love these moments, those who would watch a door lift and immediately form theories, the kind of viewers who instinctively hit like, subscribe, and drop a comment with what they would do next because it feels safer to decide from a warm chair. Elena didn't have that distance. She had cold air in her lungs and a 48-hour clock on her back, and she knew the only way through was to treat this like work, not like a miracle. A small sound in the corridor made her flinch anyway. Footsteps, slow and unhurried, and then a shadow crossing the light at the doorway. A maintenance worker stood a respectful distance away with a toolbox in one hand, older than her, bundled in a work jacket that had seen too many winters. He didn't step inside without being asked, and his restraint steadied her more than any friendly smile would have. First time opening a commercial unit? He asked, voice neutral and practical. Elena managed a nod, keeping her face calm. I didn't expect this, she said, and the word this carried everything she couldn't say out loud. The man's eyes moved over to Rose without obvious shock, like he had seen strange inventory before. They've been sitting a while, he said. If you're worried, document everything before you move anything. She lifted her phone slightly in answer, showing him the photos. He seemed to approve. If you want, we can check one the correct way, he added. Not forcing, just the service panel. Elena hesitated for a beat, then gave a small nod, because she knew she shouldn't be alone with this uncertainty. He set his toolbox down, knelt at the nearest machine, and removed the panel screws with practiced turns, moving like someone who didn't want to create damage that didn't already exist. Behind the panel sat the cassette bay. He released the latch and slid the drawer out carefully, like it might bite. One cassette was still clipped in place, scuffed green plastic that looked heavier than it should have been. When he lifted it out and set on a folded towel, Elena felt her breath snag in her throat. He opened it and revealed bills inside, mostly 20s, slightly fused at the edges by time and pressure, not stacked like a bank vault, but real enough to make her hands go cold. He counted quietly with his fingertips, lips moving, then looked up. Just under 1,000, he said, and he didn't sound excited, which was the strangest part. He sounded concerned, like a man looking at a problem that belonged to someone who never finished their job. Elena made herself do the next steps the way she would at work, because procedure was a kind of shelter. She photographed the open cassette, photographed the serial sticker on the side, wrote the amount in her notebook, and labeled a zip bag with the date and machine position before the cash ever left the towel. They put it way out of sight, because neither of them liked the idea of counting money where anyone walking past could see. With the cassette sealed and the panel closed, Elena's mind ran through questions again. Stolen, abandoned, written off, forgotten, and none of the answers felt clean. The maintenance worker pointed toward the pallet crate and the cabinet without moving too close. "There's usually paperwork somewhere with commercial stuff," he said. "If you find a service binder or a compliance case, that will tell you whether anyone still cares." Elena swallowed and nodded, then noticed something else she hadn't seen earlier. Near the back wall, the dust on the concrete had a cleaner rectangle, like something heavy had been removed and the space left behind had never been walked through again. It suggested revisits, rearranging, a plan that had stopped halfway. As she lowered the door to chest height and snapped the lock, she glanced through the chain-link fence toward the street and saw a dark sedan rolling slowly at the corner, turn signal blinking as if the driver couldn't decide where to go. It moved on, and Elena told herself it meant nothing, but the small hairs at the back of her neck lifted anyway. Before she left, she stepped back into Unit's threshold one last time and aimed her flashlight into the deepest shadow. The beam caught the edge of a flat metal case wedged behind the last machine, its latches dulled, its label partly peeled but still readable. Disposal/compliance, archive. Elena didn't open it. She only stared at it long enough to feel the room tilt slightly, because she understood that cash could be luck, machines could be inventory, but a case like that was usually a story, and stories like that rarely ended quietly. Elena returned the next day in the narrow window between the school drop-off and her evening shift, when the sky looked clean but gave no warmth, and the storage corridor smelled like cold metal and old dust. She rolled the door up just enough to slip inside, then lowered it halfway again, leaving a thin band of daylight across the concrete and the fronts of machines. The maintenance worker came back without being asked, not stepping over the threshold until she nodded, and the two of them worked like people who had both learned that careful hands prevent expensive mistakes. One machine held only a few crumpled bills caught in the feeder. Another had a cassette heavy enough to make Elena's wrists tense as she helped set on a towel, and the third surprised them with a mix of 20s and 50s that pushed the running total into numbers she was afraid to say out loud. She photographed each cereal plate, wrote each amount in her notebook with slow, steady strokes, and sealed each bag with tape, because the only thing worse than fear was confusion later. When they opened the strap crate marked spares/cash modules, the top layer looked like honest parts, cassettes, brackets, cables, until a shallow tray appeared beneath the foam. It was divided into small compartments, each holding a clear bag with something inside. Thin gold chains, a ring with a worn setting, cufflinks shaped like tiny keys, each labeled with short notes like slot retrieval and unmatched drop. Elena stared at the bags and felt her chest tighten in a different way than it had with cash. Money could be written off by strangers on paper, but jewelry always felt like it had belonged to a hand in a story, and the quiet little labels made it feel processed rather than returned. For a moment, she imagined her own life ending up like this, reduced to tagged pieces in a tray, and she swallowed hard, reminding herself that she was still standing, still choosing, still responsible for two children who believed their mother could keep the world solid. They finally pulled the flat metal case from behind the last machine and carried it to the cleanest patch of floor they could find, away from loose grit and away from the doorway. The latches opened with a dry, stubborn click, and inside were papers bound with brittle elastics, formed stacked and square like someone had once cared about neatness. The first page hit Elena like a cold slap because it had the tone of authority and the weight of a problem nobody wanted. A header about equipment decommissioning and cash reconciliation, a list of serial numbers, and columns for retrieved, balanced, and closed. Along the right edge, box after box sat unchecked, and in the margin someone had written the storage location in blue ink, circled hard enough to dent the page. It wasn't proof of a crime, but it was proof of a mess, and Elena could see the outline of what happened without anyone explaining it. A contractor fell behind, machines got parked, paperwork got handled later, and later never came. A second packet showed termination notices in write-off language that made her stomach turn, because it meant the machines had been turned into ghosts on a balance sheet, heavy and real, but nobody's responsibility anymore. Then a section titled for community events appeared, and Elena's eyes paused on a line that mentioned a hospice fundraiser and a pending deposit. The date 3 years old, the ink faded but legible. She could almost hear what people would argue if they saw those words in the bags of cash in her notebook. Some would say keep it because she bought it. Others would say return it because it's right. And the loudest would probably hit like subscribe and comment with her certainty while she stood here doing math with shaking hand. Elena didn't have certainty, only the feeling that the story inside this case had weight, and that weight could fall on her if she pretended it was only junk. The maintenance worker watched her face and said one quiet sentence that landed like a nail in wood. Paper like that means someone, somewhere, expected answers. They searched deeper with new eyes, not hunting treasure, but hunting clarity, and the back of the unit began to look less like storage and more like an abandoned worksite. Behind stacked panels and removed screens, they found two rugged black cases that didn't match the rest, their latches snapping with that tight, deliberate sound of equipment meant to travel. One held portable card terminals and foam, the kind used at pop-up booths and charity walks, clean enough to suggest they had been packed carefully before everything fell apart. The second case had coils of receipt paper and cables, and beneath them an opaque envelope sealed with clear tape, stamped with charity name and the words, "Event taking/TOB deposited." A date written in blue pen that matched the files, pending line. Elena's mouth went dry as she tipped it gently onto a towel and saw the deposit slip and the banded bills. Not an enormous fortune, but enough to make her think of warm blankets, ride vouchers, music therapy hours, and exhausted families who had handed over cash believing it would reach someone in need. She didn't let herself imagine using it, because the thought made her stomach twist, and that reaction told her what she needed to know. The maintenance worker didn't preach and didn't push. He simply nodded once and said, "That one doesn't belong to this unit, even if the contract says it does." Elena sealed the envelope back inside the case and marked it with tape as return, because even if the rest of the money turned into her way out of survival mode, she couldn't build her footing on something stamped with another person's hope. When she locked the door and walked back toward her car, she noticed the dark sedan beyond the fence again, lingering just long enough to make her shoulders stiffen, and she told herself she was tired and seeing patterns, but her instincts wouldn't settle. That night, after the twins fell asleep and the apartment quieted into its familiar creaks, Elena sat at the kitchen table with a cheap laptop, and a borrowed offline adapter the maintenance worker insisted was safer. She plugged in a USB they found tucked beside the cash handling gear, and folders bloomed across the screen with names that sounded like someone's life organized into categories: route logs, service reports, error photos, community events. She scrolled past the obvious ones until a folder near the bottom caught her eye, labeled in blunt capitals like a last decision. Personal, exit. Inside were a few text files and short videos, all dated within the same exhausted week years ago, and Elena clicked the first letter with her fingers slightly numb. The writer didn't sound like a thief. He sounded like a man drowning quietly, describing misreconciliations that multiplied, calling it shame rather than greed, admitting he hid machines because he couldn't face the calls anymore. He mentioned the charity envelope directly and wrote a single line that made Elena sit back hard in her chair. "If you find this, do right by them first, then do right by yourself." In the video, his face looked tired but steady, and he warned the viewer not to ruin their soul over metal and money. To clean it up, square what could be squared and let it end. Elena watched in silence until the screen went dark, and for the first time since she lifted that storage door, she felt something like relief mixed with grief for a stranger who had run out of road. Then her phone buzzed on the table, one sharp vibration that made her flinch, and the screen showed a number she didn't recognize. A message appeared, only 6 words, plain and cold as winter glass. "You open K9, close it." Elena read the message again with the kitchen light turned low, as if brightness could make it less true. "You open K9, close it." The words felt practiced, not furious, the kind of warning someone sends when they believe consequences still obey schedules. She didn't answer, because answering meant she was in a conversation she never agreed to join. She moved through the apartment in careful silence, checking the front lock, the stubborn window latch, the thin chain she almost never used, then pausing to listen for anything that didn't belong. Nothing had changed, yet her body held itself like it expected a knock. In the twins' doorway, she watched their blankets rise and fall, hearing the small whistle of winter air through the heater vent, and the sight steadied her for a second before it sharpened to fear. Threats felt different when they had a target, and this one had found her without needing her name. Back at the table, she laid out what she had like an inventory. The notebook with serial numbers and totals, the photos on her phone, the sealed charity envelope marked return, and the USB wrapped in a plastic bag so it wouldn't get accidentally handled. She wrote the texting number twice on paper and slid one copy into her wallet, then tucked the other under the coffee tin in the pantry. Because fear loves to erase details when the lights go out. When the clock passed midnight, she forced one steady decision that loosened the knot in her chest. She would not return to that unit alone. Not for quick check. Not while someone out there was watching her like a timer. Morning came with thin sun and the ordinary rhythm that kept her children's world stable. Elena moved through breakfast backpacks and missing mittens with a practice calm, the kind that convinces kids everything's fine even when it isn't. She walked them to the bus stop, squeezed each gloved hand, and waved until the doors folded shut and the bus pulled away. Only then did she let herself exhale. She didn't drive straight to the storage yard. She drove to a public lot near the library and sat with the engine off, thinking through consequences the way tired people do when they can't afford mistakes. If she called the police with a vague text, she risked being treated like a nuisance, and she couldn't spare that kind of tension. If she ignored it and kept working, she risked being predictable, and predictability was a gift to whoever had typed that message. She chose a third option, the one that didn't ask strangers to believe her yet. She called a maintenance worker who had helped her, keeping her voice controlled while she explained the message and the word K9. He didn't try to scare her more, and he didn't laugh it off either, which told her he understood what caution cost. Don't respond, he said, short and functional. Meet me at the hospice office first. Then we go back in daylight. Elena agreed and ended the call, then spent 10 minutes taking screenshots of her photos and notes into a single folder on her phone, the kind of tidy habit that makes later questions easier to answer. Before she left the lot, she bought an inexpensive prepaid phone and a fresh notebook, because the first rule of surviving messy situations is simple. Keep your important information somewhere a stranger can't reach through a screen. The hospice office sat in a low brick building with a ramp out front and a wreath that had faded from too many winters. Inside, the air smelled like coffee and hand lotion, and the waiting chairs squeaked softly when someone shifted. Elena asked for an administrator and waited with her hands around her bag strap, feeling the sealed envelope inside like a hot coal. When the administrator came out, Elena placed the envelope on the desk and explained where it came from without drama, just facts in the order they happened, because she needed the story to stay clean. The woman opened it, counted slowly, and her face changed in a way Elena didn't expect. Less suspicion, more grief, as if a missing piece of a hard year had just slid back into place. We wrote this off, the woman admitted quietly, and her voice tightened when she mentioned what they had cut back that season. Elena signed a receipt and took a stamped copy for her records, then stepped back into the cold, feeling lighter and heavier at the same time. In the parking lot, she sat for a moment with the maintenance worker beside her, both of them watching the building as if it mattered beyond paperwork. Elena didn't make a speech. She simply nodded once, because she knew what it cost to do the right thing when you were already tired. Before they drove off, she posted a short note on the local community board about her new repair work. Payment terminals, small equipment, fair rates, honest service. And she asked neighbors to like the post, follow her updates, and comment if they knew a shop that needed help. It wasn't performance. It was her building a safer future in daylight, one small step that couldn't be taken away by a stranger's text. They returned to the storage facility in early afternoon, when other renters came and went, and the place didn't feel like a private hallway for bad surprises. Elena kept the roll-up door only halfway open again, leaving the unit in a dim stripe of light that made the machines look like silent figures standing shoulder to shoulder. The maintenance worker brought a small step stool, a better flashlight, and a cheap camera that stamped dates on photos, and he suggested they treat the unit like a workplace, not mystery. Elena didn't argue, because work had rules, and rules made fear smaller. They worked in steady waves. Open one access panel, remove cassette, count in the back where corridor eyes couldn't see, seal the cash in a labeled bag, photograph a bay, then reset everything exactly as they found it. Her notebook filled with neat lines and totals, and the running number climbed past what she could comfortably hold in her imagination. It wasn't fantasy money, but it was real enough to change her month, her rent, her breathing. Between machines, they checked serial plates against the decommission file, matching printed numbers to dusty metal like quiet proof that she hadn't stolen anything. She had inherited someone else's unfinished work. The steel crate yielded more unclaimed items, small bags of jewelry, bent keys, deposit slips that never reached the counter, each piece labeled as if someone once believed labels could turn chaos into order. Elena's stomach tightened every time she imagined the person who dropped those items, yet the paperwork kept repeating the same cold truth. Written off, closed, abandoned. Still, the warning text wouldn't leave her mind, and she kept scanning the corridor between tasks, counting footsteps she couldn't see, listening to doors roll open in the distance. After an hour, the manager walked past with clipboard and slowed at their half-open door, drawn by the hum of careful activity. Elena kept her posture neutral, because she didn't want to look guilty or frightened, and both were easy to mistake. He didn't step inside, but his eyes tracked over the rows of machines and the stacked bags with handwritten labels, and his expression tightened with something like recognition. "You're moving fast," he said, more observation than praise. Elena gave a small nod and kept her answer simple. 48 hours goes fast, she said, and her voice held steady. The manager's gaze flicked to the corridor behind them, then back, as if weighing whether to say more. "If you're photographing everything, keep those pictures," he added, and his tone turned careful. "People come back sometimes, even after they disappear." He walked on, leaving that sentence hanging in the cold like a fog bank. The maintenance worker didn't comment, but he set his flashlight down with more care than before, and Elena felt her pulse shift upward again. People didn't threaten strangers over scrap, unless the scrap wasn't the point. She looked again at the file's margin note about internal audits, then at the cash bags, then at the little labeled jewelry pouches, and she couldn't shake the feeling that the most important thing in this unit might be something light enough to hide, not heavy enough to haul. Near the back wall, half hidden behind stack panels, Elena found a thin folder that hadn't been in the metal case the day before. It was wedged behind a machine, where dust lay thicker, and the cover was marked with block letters. K9. Her hands went colder inside her gloves. She didn't assume coincidence, because the world rarely hands you the same word twice for no reason. Inside were route notes, a short printout that looked like a checklist, and a few pages with names reduced to initials, as if someone feared writing too clearly. Elena didn't read everything. She photographed the first page, then slid the folder into her bag and zipped it fully, because she had learned that lingering over a clue in the wrong place invites new problems. When she stepped toward the doorway to breathe, the maintenance worker shifted beside her and went still for half a beat, eyes fixed down the corridor. Through the gap beyond the buildings, a dark sedan sat near the fence line, idling in a way that didn't match the restless traffic of the industrial road. It didn't rush, and it didn't park like a renter, and the driver didn't step out, which made the waiting feel intentional. Elena forced her hand steady, because panic turns people into easy targets, and she refused to be easy. She lowered the door a few inches, making the opening narrower, then slid her notebook deeper into her bag and turned her body, so the corridor couldn't see her face clearly. Her mind searched for an explanation that didn't feel like fear, and then she remembered the portable terminal case, the one that had held the charity envelope. She knelt, checked the foam again, and ran her gloved fingers along seams the way she checked a winter coat for lost bus passes. Something flat caught under the insert, too thin to notice unless you were looking for hidden layers. She pinched it out and held it close under the flashlight. It was a printed photograph, low quality, like a cheap office printer, showing the storage corridor from the far end. The image captured a blue door half raised and a woman standing at the threshold, and even in the blur, Elena recognized her own coat and the angle of her shoulders. Beneath the photo, someone had typed a single line, "Close K, 9, or we come for the rest." Her fingers went numb around the paper, and her throat tightened with a sudden understanding that the warning wasn't about machines or leftover cash. It was about the fact that someone had been close enough to watch her, close enough to print proof, and patient enough to wait. And the only question left was brutally simple. What exactly did they think the rest meant, and how far would they go to take it back? Elena did not drive home with the photo on her passenger seat, like a trophy or a clue. She slid into a plain envelope, folded the K9 folder beneath it, and kept both buried under a grocery bag of receipts and snack wrappers, because a messy car looked ordinary and ordinary felt safer. The maintenance worker walked her to her car without hovering, eyes scanning the fence line once more before he stepped back. The dark sedan was gone by then, but the absence did not comfort her. It only proved the driver knew when to vanish. Elena waited until she was 2 streets away before she called the one person who could hold a line between fear and procedure, the administrator of the hospice, and asked if their office could share a contact at the county level for donation recovery and documentation. She never said threat, never said stalker, yet her voice carried enough weight that the woman didn't argue. By late afternoon, Elena sat in a small conference room at the hospice with a space heater clicking softly under the table, an older county investigator across from her, and the envelope lay flat between them like something fragile. Elena explained the storage auction purchase, the machines, the leftover cash, the decommissioned file, the USB, and the labeled hospice envelope she had already returned. Then she placed the photo down last and watched the investigator's face tighten in a way that told her the message was no longer just a text. He asked for copies, not originals, and he asked her to keep the actual K9 folder sealed until he could log it properly, because chain of custody mattered if someone tried to rewrite the story later. Elena agreed, not because she suddenly trusted systems, but because she understood one simple truth. Secrets were what the person in the sedan wanted, and she refused to play on their field. That evening, she kept the twins' routine steady, because children notice the shape of silence long before they understand its cause. Dinner smelled like tomato soup and grilled cheese, the cheap kind that still made the kitchen feel warm, and Elena laughed at the right moments while her mind stayed 2 steps ahead. After homework and showers, she tucked them in with the usual promises about skating soon and school concerts definitely. Then she sat at the table with her prepaid phone and wrote a plan in the new notebook. First, the unit gets cleared under daylight, with a second adult present and with photos of every stage. Second, the cash found in cassette stays bagged, labeled, and deposited through a bank teller with written confirmation, because clean money needs a clean trail. Third, the machines and parts get sold only after she has written proof the equipment was written off and the sale is legal. Fourth, the USB gets imaged by someone who can do it without contaminating it, because the wrong click could erase what she needed most. The list did not erase fear, but it boxed fear into tasks, and tasks were something she could manage. In the quiet that followed, her phone buzzed again with a number she did not recognize, then stopped before the call could ring twice. A minute later, another message appeared, shorter than the last. Tomorrow, noon. Elena stared at it until her eyes stung, then turned the prepaid phone off and slid it into a jar in the pantry beside the coffee tin. She did not want her children waking to a buzzing sound that made their mother's shoulders jump. She wanted them waking to pancakes, and she needed to believe she could still provide that. Morning brought thin sunlight and the sound of plows scraping slush along the curb, loud and ordinary, the kind of noise that made the world feel supervised. Elena walked the twins to the bus stop again, breathing in cold air that smelled faintly of diesel and wet pavement, then returned her car without rushing. She didn't go straight to the storage facility. She went to the bank first, because the safest place for temptation was behind glass and paperwork. The teller's hands moved quickly, counting the label bags Elena had already filled under the maintenance worker's watch, and printing receipts that broke down the deposit amounts into neat lines. Elena asked for copies and kept them in a folder, because she had learned that honest people still needed proof when fear was involved. At mid-morning, she stopped at a small print shop and printed her photos in date order, then stapled them to a simple timeline. Auction purchase, first open, first cassette, charity envelope recovered, file discovered, threat received. The clerk did not care, and that indifference helped. Right before noon, Elena drove to the storage yard with the maintenance worker in a second car behind her and a county investigator parked 2 rows away, visible enough to discourage bravado without turning the place into a spectacle. Elena's hands shook when she unlocked the door, but she lifted it anyway, and the unit's cold, electrical tang met her like a memory. No sedan waited at the fence line, yet Elena could feel eyes in the gaps of the place, in the pauses between footsteps. When the maintenance worker asked if she was ready, she answered with a single nod, because she did not trust her voice to sound calm. They worked deeper than they had before, and the deeper they went, the more Elena understood what the thread had been protecting. In a plastic bin behind the last row of machines, taped under a layer of receipt rolls, they found another sealed envelope with a processing company logo and a simple label, Audit Returns. Inside were copies of emails, route schedules, and a list of locations that matched the Legacy Charity Events folder on the USB, with several lines highlighted in yellow. There was nothing dramatic in the pages, just patterns, machines pulled from certain sites, deposits delayed, small shortfalls marked to correct next run, then never corrected. Elena's fear shifted shape into something clearer. Someone did not want a tired single mother holding a paper trail that could embarrass a company, a contractor, or a person who had been quietly cleaning money out of small errors. It wasn't a movie vault. It was slow leakage, the kind that survives because everyone is too busy to look closely. In the corridor, a door rolled up 2 units down, and then rolled down again without anyone stepping out, a quick metallic rattle that made Elena's stomach drop. The county investigator, watching from a distance, moved his weight and glanced toward the office, and Elena saw a calm signal pass between adults who knew how to wait. In the middle of that tension, Elena stepped out of the unit, pulled her coat tighter, and posted one short update on her small business page, careful with words and free of details. Big week, grateful for local support, appointments opening after the holidays. She asked people like the page, follow for updates, and comment if they knew a shop that needed help, because she needed more than money now. She needed a community that recognized her name as work, not trouble. When the confrontation came, it came without shouting, which somehow made it worse. A man in a dark cap appeared at the end of the corridor, as if he had always belonged there, walking with the quick confidence of someone who expected doors to open for him. He stopped when he saw Elena and the maintenance worker standing inside the half-raised unit door. Then he smiled in a way that never reached his eyes. He didn't step closer. He held distance like it was part of his routine. "You bought the wrong unit," he said, voice low, almost polite. Elena kept her chin level and let silence stretch long enough for the maintenance worker's presence to matter. The man's gaze flicked over Elena's hands, her bag, her pocket, as if he was searching for something small. "I can make it easy," he added. "Hand over the drive and the folder. Keep the scrap." Elena heard her own heartbeat, steady and loud, and she thought of her children's faces at breakfast, the way they trusted her to keep the world simple. She did not threaten him. She did not bargain. She simply said, "No." One clean syllable, and stepped back into the unit's shadow as if she were closing a door without touching it. That was enough. The man's smile vanished, replaced by a flat irritation, and he took one step forward as if he might test whether fear could be pushed into surrender. He never got the chance. The county investigator and 2 uniformed deputies appeared from the side aisle in a controlled, fast walk, not running, not dramatic, just inevitable. The man froze, then turned sharply as if he could melt into the corridor, and the deputies took his arms with practiced restraint. No punches, no chaos, just the quiet clack of handcuffs and the sound of the gate code beeping in the distance. Elena's knees went weak anyway, because courage does not stop the body from reacting. The investigator asked her gently to stay where she was and breathe, because witnesses forget details when adrenaline peaks. Elena nodded and stared at the blue metal door beside her until the color settled her, a single solid thing that did not change shape. The next week moved like a series of careful steps across ice, each one tested before weight was fully placed. Elena gave the investigator copies of the K-9 folder and the audit envelope, along with the printed timeline and the bank deposit receipts that showed exactly what she had found and where it had gone. The USB was imaged by a technician using an offline setup, and Elena was told, in plain words, that the files confirmed what the decommissioned paperwork suggested. A contractor had walked away from equipment and unresolved cash handling, and someone else had tried to retrieve the most damaging pieces after the public auction made that impossible to control quietly. The man in the cap, it turned out, was not a master criminal. He was a former subcontractor tied to the route, someone who knew enough to be dangerous and not enough to stay clean. The county didn't promise Elena a windfall or a trophy, but they did give her something more valuable. A written statement that the equipment in the unit was legally abandoned and auctioned, and that the documented cash deposits she made were considered lawful proceeds under the sale, pending any verified claims. No verified claims appeared, because claims require paperwork, and the people who rely on silence rarely want court records. The hospice administrator sent Elena a short letter thanking her for returning the envelope and explaining what the funds are stored, and Elena kept that letter in the same folder as the bank receipts, because it reminded her the story's heart was not money, it was choice. With the legal ground steady enough to stand on, Elena cleared the unit the way she had promised herself she would, one machine at a time, with a chain of receipts that could survive anyone's questions. She sold the ATMs as decommissioned hardware to a refurbisher 2 counties over, not for fantasy numbers, but for solid, realistic checks tied to serial lists. She sold spare cassettes and terminals in batches, keeping invoices and documenting every handoff, because the difference between a fresh start and a fresh problem is usually paperwork. The total she netted did not turn her into a different class of person overnight, but it lifted her out of the constant edge. She paid the debts that had been growing teeth, fixed the car before winter could break it, and set aside a 3-month cushion that let her breathe without checking her phone after every grocery run. She didn't quit the motel immediately, because stability takes time to trust, but she cut her hours down and used the daylight to build her small repair service into something real. The first time a corner store owner shook her hand and thanked her for getting a terminal working before a holiday rush, Elena felt a warmth that had nothing to do with money. It felt like proof that she could build a life that wasn't always reacting. Spring arrived quietly, as it often does in towns that don't make a show of seasons. The slush vanished. The curbside ice melted into thin streams, and sunlight started reaching the kitchen window earlier each morning. Elena took the twins skating on a weekday evening the way she had promised, the rink air smelling like cold metal and hot chocolate, and she watched them glide in uneven loops with a happiness that didn't need new toys to be loud. At home, she framed 2 pieces of paper and hung them above her tiny desk, the hospice receipt and the county statement confirming the unit's legal status. To anyone else, they looked like boring documents, but to Elena, they were a map of how a person survives fear without becoming the kind of person fear expects. The maintenance worker still stopped by sometimes, not as a rescuer, but as a friend who understood what it means to do careful work in a messy world. They spoke about ordinary things, school schedules, weather, small repairs, Because ordinary talk is what life sounds like when it's finally safe enough to be boring. Elena never told her children every detail, because they didn't need to wait, but she did tell them one simple truth that fit their age. Sometimes you find someone that could help you, and you still have to do the right thing with it. They nodded like children do, half understanding, and years later that sentence would be one of the bricks in whatever kind of adults they became. The moral that settled over Elena's story was not the usual: luck changes everything. Because luck had not carried her through the hard parts. What carried her was clarity under pressure, the willingness to document instead of hide, and the decision to ask for help before fear could isolate her. She learned that money found without context is never just money, and that the cleanest way to keep a blessing is to treat it like responsibility first. She learned that doing the right thing does not always cost you the future you want. Sometimes it protects it quietly, before you even notice. And she learned that a single mother doesn't need to become fearless to become strong. She only needs to keep moving while fear tries to make her freeze. By the time the next winter arrived, her apartment didn't look like a miracle, but it looked cared for, and the difference mattered. The tree stood straighter, the bills were paid on time, and the twins' laughter came easier because it didn't have to compete with constant worry. Every now and then Elena would drive past the storage yard on her way to service call, see the rows of blue doors, and feel a small private gratitude that she had opened the right one in the right way, and then, just as importantly, had known when to close it. Elena did not talk about the storage unit the way people talk about a lucky break, because luck implies nothing was learned and nothing was paid for. In the months after the arrest and the paperwork, she treated her life like a system that needed regular maintenance. She built a simple routine that held even when stress tried to bend it. Invoices on the kitchen table after dinner, deposits on Fridays, parts orders only after she verified the job. The twins saw their home change in small, steady ways, not through sudden luxury, but through fewer tense silences. The fridge stopped carrying final notices, and the same space held school drawings and a calendar with clear plans. On mornings when the air felt sharp and winter returned to the sidewalks, Elena still felt that old instinct to brace for impact, but it came less often. The hardest shift was inside her, where she stopped expecting the ground to vanish. She didn't become careless with money or time. She became calm with both, and that calm turned into something the children could lean on without noticing they were leaning. The motel job slowly turned from a lifeline into a bridge she could step off of. Elena kept 1 or 2 shifts a week at first, mostly for the health coverage and because she didn't trust a new path too quickly. Then her repair work began to fill the gaps with something better than desperation. A corner store called because their terminal kept failing during lunch rush, and she fixed it without drama. A small church asked her to set up a secure card reader for a community dinner fundraiser, and she explained it in plain words that didn't make anyone feel embarrassed. Word traveled the way it always does in a town like hers, through handshakes and quiet recommendations, not flashy ads. Her notebook of clients grew one careful line at a time, and the name she chose for the business started appearing on receipts she could file with pride. She never pretended she was an expert in everything. She stayed honest about what she knew and what she needed to research. That honesty, more than any single job, became the reason people trusted her to return. The twins carried their own version of the story, because children always do, even when adults try to keep things gentle. They didn't know the details of the dark sedan or the folder label, and Elena kept it that way on purpose. What they did know was that their mother stopped flinching at unknown numbers, and she stopped staring at the bank app like it was an enemy. They knew there were evenings when she could say yes without counting every dollar out loud. They knew that skating night finally happened, and it didn't end early because of a sudden worry. They knew their boots stayed dry, their school fees got paid, and the car started on the first try more often than not. Those changes taught them a lesson deeper than any lecture could deliver. Stability is not a gift that appears. It is something a person builds and protects. Elena watched that understanding settle into them, and it eased the guilt she had carried for years, the guilt of raising children inside constant uncertainty. The maintenance worker stayed in Elena's life, but not as a savior and not as a romance written to impress anyone. He became the person who showed up when a job was heavy and who left when his presence was no longer needed. Sometimes he helped her lift an old machine onto a dolly, and sometimes he sat at her kitchen table and drank coffee while the twins argued about homework. Their connection grew through ordinary consistency, the kind that feels almost invisible until it becomes dependable. Elena liked that he never asked her to prove she was strong. He simply treated her strength as real. When she had a bad day, he didn't push for a dramatic talk. He asked what she needed next. That approach fit the life Elena wanted now, where safety was built from clear steps and honest choices. If something deeper ever came later, It would come the same way everything good in her life came now. Slowly, with respect and without forcing it. The storage unit itself faded into something quieter, a chapter filed away instead of a door left half open. Elena never went back without a reason, and she stopped checking over her shoulder every time she passed an industrial street. The county investigator sent a final note confirming the case had closed with charges tied to intimidation and attempted recovery of evidence, and that the hospice money had been formally logged as returned. Elena kept that note with her other documents, not because she enjoyed remembering fear, but because it reminded her that doing the right thing can be measurable. She framed the hospice receipt beside her small workbench, where she fixed terminals under a bright lamp, and she let it sit there like a quiet guardrail. Some evenings she would glance at it and think about the man who wrote the personal exit files, not with anger but with sober compassion. People can make a mess without intending cruelty, and that truth doesn't excuse harm, but it helps a person stay human while cleaning it up. A year later, when the same tired winter returned and the town tried again to look festive, Elena found herself noticing different details. She noticed how the streetlights made the snow glow softly instead of looking dirty, and how the twins' laughter sounded fuller when it wasn't squeezed by worry. She noticed that her own shoulders sat lower, that she could plan a week ahead without fear of one surprise collapsing everything. The moral that stayed with her was not that storage units hide miracles, because they usually do not. The moral was that character shows up most clearly when the choice feels private, when no one is watching, and when it would be easy to justify the wrong thing. Elena's life improved because she documented what she found, returned what was clearly not hers, and refused to let fear isolate her into silence. Thank you for watching and staying with this story to the end. If Elena's choices meant something to you, a quick like, a subscribe, and a comment about what you would have done in her place helps more stories like this find their way to the right people.